So land, that's obvious, it's real property. But fixtures, how do we decide if something is a fixture or not? So we looked at 3 different factors that can help us determine, is this piece of what would otherwise be classified personal property, is it, under the circumstances, something that should be treated as a fixture and legally treated as if it's real property? So the 3 factors were adaptation, attachment, and intent. And this is, of course, objective intent. What would a third person standing in the room think these people intended? But we talked about how the most important factor of those 3 is intent. Because really intent, there's no other verb, intent trumps the other 2. Because really those other 2, attachment and adaptation, all that they're trying to do is to tease out what the intent of the parties was. So if you look at something that's attached to the land, maybe it's a little shed you bought at the Home Depot in your backyard, and it's just sort of spiked, nailed into the ground with big spikes, right? So it's not real property. It's not a building that's constructed on the land necessarily. It could be pretty easily moved. So attachment, is it attached to the land? Well, maybe. Adaptation, does it qualify as something that is only useful on this piece of property? No, you could move it around and maybe use it on some other piece of property. Side note, think of like the fuel tanks in that Chevron case that we talked about, even though it's not in the book. They were fixtures because they're buried in the ground, that's attachment, and also adaptation. That site is worthless as a gas station unless those gas tanks are there. So then back to our shed example, intent. So if attachment and adaptation are a little bit up in the air, it's hard to say, then look at the intent of the parties. If their contract for the sale of land said this shed is going with the house, the purchaser is buying it, then that's the intent of the parties. Extend that out and realize that the intent of the parties is the most important factor. So even if something seems like a fixture based on attachment and adaptation, if the parties in their contract said it's to be treated as personal property rather than a fixture, that's the intent of the parties, and that trumps the other 2 factors, right? So we had a test question about this where I gave you something that it looks like a fixture, it smells like a fixture, it's attached to the land like a fixture, but if the parties said it's not to be treated as a fixture, it's to be treated as personal property, and the seller takes that property with him or her, then that's the intent of the parties, and that is what controls under the circumstances. I think in the test question it was like a light fixture maybe, or something like that. And in the contract the parties said, or wait, no, it was even more complicated. It was sinks and ovens and kitchen cooking stuff at a place where they teach cooking lessons, right? Maybe you remember, I don't know. So it looked like fixtures, but the parties in their contract said not to be treated like fixtures. What does that even mean? What happens if it is treated like a fixture? That means when you sell the real property, you are also selling the fixture. That's why it matters. Fixtures are treated the same as real property under property law. That's probably enough, if not more than enough on that. Estates and land, this is simple. We only talked about 2 different estates. There are a lot, and it gets really complicated. But we didn't get into any of that, thankfully. We talked about fee simple, sometimes called fee simple absolute. That just means you own this land, you own all the rights for all time in this land. Your ownership of the land isn't limited in any way. Remember that with ownership of property, it's like a bundle of sticks. So you've got all these different rights, and you can divide it up, and you can sell certain rights to other people. Maybe if you're a landlord and you're leasing your property, you're giving up, I'm getting ahead of myself, but you're giving up the right to possession and use of the property, but you still own the property. With fee simple, that means you have all the sticks in the bundle. That's all. A life estate just means you have unlimited rights to the property for our purposes. You can't commit waste, but the book just barely scratches on that subject. In other words, you can't deplete the value of the property, but you basically can do whatever you want. You treat it as property that you own, but when you die, you don't decide where it goes, because that's when your estate, when your life estate ends. And the next person who gets the land is whoever gave you the land, if that makes any sense. So if somebody's parents die and they give their land to their kid for life, and then to the Red Cross or to a hospital or something like that, the kid gets to use the land and do whatever he wants for the rest of his life. Treat it like he owns it, live on it. If it's farmland, you get to farm it, you get to keep the profits, all of that. But even if your will says you intend to give the land to your brother or your son, it doesn't matter, because you don't have that right to dispose it after your death. Once you die, it immediately goes to the hospital or the Red Cross, wherever your parents wanted it to go. That's a life estate. Co-ownership of land, this is where maybe it got a little bit confusing when we talked about joint tenancy. But before we even start talking a little bit about co-ownership, remember that I mentioned courts really don't like to encourage co-ownership of land. And that's part of why it's kind of complicated, and any co-owner has the right to split up the interest. It's called a partition, and we didn't really talk about it, but if two people are co-owners of land and one of them wants out, they don't have to agree on that, even if it's 50-50 ownership. They don't have to agree, they don't have to take a vote. One of them can do what's called partition and force the court to either sell the land or divide it up in an equal way, physically divide the land. That's kind of bad. If you're a co-owner of land, you don't want to be susceptible to that, right? You want certainty. You want to know what's going to happen with your land. You don't want one of the other 10 co-owners to have this power. So that's one way in which co-ownership is really not encouraged. It's complicated, and there's that right to split up the land, right? To partition the land. But anyway, we had different types of co-ownership, right? So there's tenancy in common. That's the most common way of owning land. It's sort of the default way of owning land if you're going to have co-ownership. And the shares don't have to be equal. You could have 3 co-owners. One owns 10%, another owns 20%, and the other owns the remaining, 70% of the land. So the shares don't have to be equal. And there are no other complicated rules. The right of survivorship doesn't apply, which we'll talk about with joint tenancy. Speaking of, joint tenancy has this weird thing called the right of survivorship, and all of the shares have to be equal.